Hello, and welcome to the Godot community for high school 3D visual art. Our topics are going to be three-dimensional composition, specifically the formal qualities, those elements and principles, and how they are applied to 3D composition, and then beyond the elements and principles. So what does composition mean in 3D art and design? So before we get started, I want to talk about the list of elements and principles. So this list was compiled from what we use at my school in my school district as the elements and principles. However, I think that this list is pretty fluid. So I think that we are all probably teaching basically the same elements and principles. So if you have different things than what you see here, I think that that's okay. You see repetition pops up a lot. I have contrast on this list, but really in my county, we just talk about emphasis. I have scale on this list, but our list of principles really only has proportion. So this is not the official list, so it's just the list that I typically go by in my classroom. So I'm going to talk about specific differences or ways in which the elements and principles are applied differently in some cases to 3D art and design. In some cases, it's the same, but in many ways, there are some slight differences. So the most important for me element for sculpture is form because all 3D work has form. So we know that form is a three-dimensional mass that has height, width, and depth. But I think it's also important to talk about how form can indicate both the individual parts or the entire sculpture. Shape is another tricky one. It's one that my students I know use a lot and they want to call a form a shape. So I think it's important to differentiate between the two because at its root, a shape is flat, it's two-dimensional. So I think it's best to use shape to describe the silhouette or the outline of a sculpture. Texture is an easy one and a great one. I always tell my students, especially in my ceramics classes, that texture is one of the most important elements because clay is really all about texture in some cases. So to have an understanding that texture in sculpture is most of the time actual and something that can actually be felt, I think is an important differentiation from 2D work. Space is another goodie. I tell my students that the negative space is often as equally important as the positive space. So sculpture can't exist without taking up space. So to have a good understanding of that importance and the balance between positive and negative space is something that is worth discussing as well. Line. For me, I refer to line in sculpture as a surface, something that is applied. Students often refer to where two planes meet as a line, but really these are just edges. So I try to get them to see the difference, sometimes more successfully than others. Color often is applied the same way in two-dimensional as three-dimensional art. However, it's important to note that a lot of times artists choose the materials that they use. In both ceramics, I can think of works from metal. The artists are choosing these materials because of the surface as well as, other characteristics. So they often leave the natural color of the material. Value. A great talking point is that value, when applied to a two-dimensional surface, is unchanging. So you're putting dark blue paint on something, that dark blue is always going to be the same dark blue. However, in three-dimensional form, value on a surface changes based on the light source. So it's a really great talking point for students to start thinking about how light and shadow affect viewing sculptural work. Now on to the principles. Balance. Balance, of course, is that equalization of visual weight. However, in sculpture, it could also be actual physical balance. So we talk about that in regard to structure. Proportion is a really good one, especially in if you also reference scale. Um, we know that proportion is a size relationship of one part of a sculpture to another part in that same work. But often, especially with public works, we talk about the scale of the work in reference to its surroundings. Contrast is pretty much the same in 3D as it is in 2D. It is that difference between two things, opposing elements, that often creates a sense of emphasis. Unity, again, similar in 2D to 3D. So it's the appearance that the components are working in harmony and that everything belongs together. Variety, again, 2D to 3D, it's that different and contrasting elements within a single work. Pattern, again, similar to 2D in that it is a repetition of a design element. I do tell my students that one slight difference can be that the pattern can be the repetition of a texture or it could be the repetition of a form. And then you have movement, and movement is the sense of motion. Also, in sculpture, that could be actual movement. So think of kinetic sculpture a la Mobile by Alexander Calder. And then lastly, we have rhythm, and rhythm in 2D and 3D, very similar. It is that movement that is achieved through the repetition, alteration, or progression of an element. So, once all of this information has been covered in class, a great reinforcement activity is to have students find their own 3D examples that show the demonstration of the elements and principles. I typically might just do the principles. However, I think that it's important from the beginning that students are looking at work, both contemporary and historical, but especially contemporary. And in turn, they are showing you, I have them find images. They have to credit the image with the title, the artist, the year it was made, and then they have to give me an explanation of why they think that that work is a good example of the element or principle. From there, we start talking about other compositional qualities of 3D art and design. So I think that students in beginning or entry level 3D courses really just think about the form itself and really not about the presentation of the form. So I think it's natural for the beginning levels to be making things that maybe you're just putting on a wood block or putting on a pedestal and it's to be viewed from all sides on some sort of display. And it's really later that students start to think about that engagement of space and how some sculptures are created with the intention of the environment in mind prior to beginning construction of the form. So here are some examples from students in my county. Some are mine, some are from one of my colleagues, Travis Carr, where the students specifically had these environments in mind prior to beginning work. The image on the left was a student who wanted to build these houses and then photograph them, their deterioration over time. Obviously, the lilies in the water are more effective as a site-specific work as well. Lighting is another factor that students start to take into consideration, I think, when they get a little farther along. So in addition to the environment, start thinking about how the light source and shadow affect the viewer experience. So the images on the left and the right, which are sort of these serial plane sculptures, really rely a lot on the shadow to be more visually interesting and effective. The image in the center, the student projected this sort of paint splattered plexiglass or acetate onto a wall, and it was slides were interchangeable and could be layered, and it was more of an interactive experience. But again, light playing an important factor. I think composition in 2D art is really easy to talk about because everything is sort of bound within this picture plane. So trying to get students to understand that we are not bound by these borders, that we can engage space, and the space and the environment can actually become part of what we are communicating through form, is a really important lesson to start talking about early on. Thank you for joining me. I hope, as always, that this information is helpful for you and the work that you're doing in your classrooms on a daily basis. Thank you.